Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime.
All right, Hayden, I need you to tell me.
Are we going to tell them about our lives?
Sure, we can tell them about our lives.
Okay. Do you want to go first?
I think you want me to go first.
I do.
I live in England now.
Yeah?
And everything feels fake still. So, what about you? You started a job on Monday. How is that?
I did. I took a job working in substance use recovery and mental health, working as a therapist and a group facilitator. And I'm really excited to be in the environment I am and to learn more. My first week was really, really cool. I loved it, but it was also super exhausting. It was a very long week, but I'm really excited to learn more about treating substance use disorder and helping those with extreme cases of mental health disturbance.
It's so funny that we both went back to work basically at the same time.
It was a very relaxing 4 months that I took, my sabbatical.
Yep.
And I appreciated it for the ability to refresh and recharge me. But it also made me really grateful to be working again. I feel tired when I come home. I sleep through the night. I feel like what I do has purpose. I feel like I'm helping people. I feel like I'm getting to use my brain in a way that is both challenging and exciting. And I look forward to really improving my ability to diagnose mental health ailments and disorders because while I do have an understanding of it and I can make diagnoses, I'm excited to make them confidently.
Yeah. I liked my 4 months and I went back to work out of necessity so that I could make money. Because if you told me right now that I could just work on the podcast and not have to go in somewhere to do work, I would be fine with that. But I like my job. I mean, I just would not dislike not having a job.
I like to be productive. I like to be busy. So,
You know, I stayed busy. I've got a drill sergeant, somebody on this podcast.
that's true. That's true. You do. You do. And you have to do edits. Yeah, you like to be busy. We like different kinds of busy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We both seem kind of tired right now.
Well, it's almost 6 o'clock here.
Can't even imagine how late it is here right now.
It's noon. Okay. Anyway, tell me what you know about dissociative identity disorder.
Ooh, DID. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert in DID. I think what I know about it is kind of the worst stereotypes about DID. I think my brain automatically goes to the movie Me, Myself, and Irene with Jim Carrey and Renee Zellweger.
Okay.
I think about movies like Split with James McAvoy. And that's where my brain goes when someone mentions DID or dissociative identity disorder. I do know that DID typically has a traumatic precursor to its formation, something so traumatic that the psyche cannot process the trauma and therefore has to segment itself in a way to make the situation livable or tolerable and escape the pain of whatever that traumatic incident is. If I remember correctly, DID was not a part of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual or Diagnostician Statistical DSM-5-TR, right? It was not a part of the DSM until the DSM-5.
Okay. That might be wrong because I want to say that I read about it in DSM-3.
So I just looked it up. Multiple personality disorder was in DSM-3. And then the term was revised to dissociative identity disorder in the DSM-4. So my mistake. I thought it was multiple personality until DSM-5. But it looks like DSM-4 is when it was labeled DID.
Okay. I bet with your knowledge of DID and how it's formed, you're excited for me to get into this case.
I'm
that I
not.
have texted you about multiple times to make sure that you know that what I am going to tell you today is a lot. It is a difficult case, so you have been warned, and listeners, consider this your warning as well.
I've been excited to see you. I've been excited for you to tell me a story, but I have not been excited to hear this story. I can't even begin to anticipate how dark and awful this is going to be, because I think of Junko Furuta, and that made my stomach turn.
This made my stomach turn.
Okay. Let's start turning stomachs.
All right.
Did I say tummocs?
Sturning stomachs. I don't know. I think
Let's
you
start
said
turning stomachs.
I think you said it right.
Okay.
All right. In 1974, Pat and Richard Haynes of London, England, moved to the suburbs of Sydney, Australia.
Okay.
International move. None of that was intentional. This case has been on my roster for a long time. I just needed a good amount of time to be able to put this together. The couple had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, who was the youngest.
What are their names?
Jenny is the middle child, and her older sister is Sheila, and her younger brother is Frank.
No, the parents.
Pat and Richard
Pat
Haynes.
and Richard. Okay.
When Jenny was 2, her father Richard began vaginally raping her.
We're not even fucking 2 minutes into this case, and a 2-year-old is being vaginally raped.
Prior
assaulted.
to that, it was primarily digital, anal, and oral penetration.
Cool. Okay. I'm so ready for what the next 6,200 words are going to bring. I'm sure it only gets better after this.
I read a very graphic book about this. It was a lot. I don't know if I've mentioned that yet, but it was a lot.
Thank you for bringing it to me.
I know that this actually makes it worse, but nobody dies.
Great. Extended suffering. Dick doesn't even die. Richard,
Not
the
yet.
abusing father.
Not yet.
Okay.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, please continue. I want to not interrupt anymore.
According to Jenny, Richard was not just abusing her sexually, but also emotionally and psychologically and physically. I mean, every way that you can. And he enjoyed every minute of the abuse and the torture that he forced upon Jenny. In her book, The Girl in the Green Dress, she mentioned that he would tell her to stop crying, but that she felt that was just words because he seemed to be aroused by her pain and suffering. A lot of this was written in retrospect. She did not have the words for this when it was happening. She did not know. He just called this her punishments, and he told her that she deserved her punishments. So there's that. He kept her from reporting him by threatening to kill her mother, her brother, her sister, and her cat, all while assuring her that he was able to harm her because no one reciprocated the love she had for her family members. He used his actions and his words to make Jenny believe that she was valueless. He also used her love of her family against her by threatening to harm Sheila the way that he was harming Jenny, at which point Jenny, for all intents and purposes, would sacrifice herself to save Sheila by telling him to do whatever he had to do to her, as long as it meant he would leave Sheila alone.
Did he leave Sheila alone?
Sheila had never alleged that their father abused her in all the ways that he abused Jenny. But we are going to get more into Sheila's story when we get later in the case.
Do all of the children have stories?
I mean, he was abusive.
Okay.
Although he was abusive generally to the family, he threatened to kill his wife with regularity. He would seemingly do nefarious things, such as hide Frank's shoes and then blame all 3 children for losing or taking them when they denied it, or poking his finger into food in the refrigerator and then again blaming the children for this simply to create a reason to beat them all.
What a fucking violator. Weird. I mean, already he's terrible, right? You've already told me, my God, what I hope is the worst. I'm sure it's fucking not, but creating scenarios to make it acceptable to beat or harm your children.
Yeah. I am going to spare you and our besties many of the details that Jenny included in her book in case anyone is currently eating, recently ate, or plans to eat ever again.
or wants
But-
to sleep tonight, or wants to not move through the world thinking about the terrible things that Richard did to his family.
But so you can get a sense for what Jeni was made to endure at the hands of her father. I'll tell you about a little ritual he started on her 7th birthday and its evolution over time. Months prior, the children had one of those toys where it has different 3-dimensional blocks that you have to fit into a box with matching shapes on it.
Like a star, a square,
Yes,
a circle.
a plus sign, yeah. And you have to orient the pieces just so that it works, right? The cylindrical piece went missing, and Jeni believed her father had taken it because he had decided it could serve a different use.
Oh, God.
On her 7th birthday, he visited her at night, as he did often, and for her birthday, he told her that she was going to be giving birth as he shoved something inside of her vagina and then forced her to birth it. She said it felt similar to that cylindrical piece of toy that she and her siblings hadn't seen in a while. It was challenging and painful to try to force it out of herself because the body of a 7-year-old child is not equipped to give birth. But eventually she would, and then Richard would hold up a little doll that was covered in slime, which was possibly another psychological game of control and manipulation, because she said it always was so confusing for her because what had been forced inside of her felt smooth, not jagged like a doll. As she got older, she was made to, quote, give birth every year on her birthday. But about 3 months or so after she turned 8, this birthday ritual expanded. Richard would rape Jeni 9 months prior to her birthday and would then tell her she was pregnant and, quote, in due course, she would be giving birth, which would then happen 9 months later on her birthday.
Sick.
So like I said, this started 9 months before her 9th birthday, and Jeni was due to, quote, give birth 7 times. And this was just part of her father's sick, twisted game.
Like she endured that for 9 birthdays?
Like the having to give birth part?
Uh-huh.
Yes. And then 7 of those were, actually it's not very clear to me. She had to, when she was 7 and 8, she had to do the ritual where, and then 7 times after that, she was due to give birth because he would rape her 9 months prior.
So that went all the way through her 18th birthday?
No, but I didn't allow myself to get bogged down by the
details.
numbers, really.
Right, yeah.
Because we're talking about somebody recalling, and Jeni remembers, between Jeni and, in case you can't figure out where this is going, her alters all remember everything that happened to them in great detail, but it's still coming from a child or children, so the timing.
Sure.
Over the years that Richard committed depraved acts against his daughter, the violence with which he acted escalated to the point that Jeni's organs were damaged so extensively that she had to use an ostomy bag.
Did nobody know?
We're going to get there. We're going to get there. We're going to talk about, trust me, all of the questions that you have, most of the questions that you have, I address them because I think any person would have some of these questions. Every person has had some of these questions. In her book, Jeni goes into graphic detail about what she had to endure. With regard to the book, The Girl in the Green Dress that Jeni wrote, according to reviews, the fact that it is written using her own voice is particularly beautiful yet challenging to read. It's harrowing, really, to have an adult reflect on what was happening to her when she was too young to have the words for it. Even for those who may be desensitized due to the nature of their work or their interest in topics like true crime, was what some of the reviews about the book said.
As you're telling me this story, this is easily going to be the most disturbing case we've covered. I already know that. It makes me think PTSD is not always the result of a direct first-person experience. PTSD can form through vicarious trauma, through reading, listening, watching, or witnessing any kind of act of trauma, and is then taken on by the individual who consumes it in whatever sensorial way, right? And so, again, a word of caution to listeners, if you are particularly susceptible to anything related to abuse or graphic sexual material or traumatic violent material,
medical trauma.
Yeah, this is the time to check out. This is not the one for you, and that's okay. You do not have to soldier through it.
But we will.
We will. Because of this, we're fine. We're steel. We are hardened alloy. Neither of us has ever had a mental health issue.
Okay, on that note,
I'm going to double up on Prozac for the next week.
hey, Prozac comes up later.
I bet it does. I bet Prozac does fit in somewhere here.
Okay, so you know how Jeni coped with this abuse, given her age at the time that the abuse began, the fact that her abuser was supposed to be someone who nurtured and protected her, and the severity of the sexual abuse. Her mind, in order to help her survive and to protect her from the abuse, fractured in a sense and created what are commonly referred to as personalities or alters, both of which are short for alternate personality. What do you know about alters?
I know that there can be numerous alters. I know that they can take various forms. They serve different purposes. They can act as a buffer for certain types of trauma. Maybe one alter is specifically geared to manage the experience of receiving sexual trauma. Maybe there's another alter that even deals with just the processing of that sexual trauma. There can be alters that operate as paternal or maternal figures that are meant to care for the other primary personality. Alters can span a continuum. They can be different ages. They can have different intents. They can work in different capacities. So I think that's kind of what I know about them.
They can span genders. Mm-hmm. They can be male. They can be female. They can be, like, Jeni has alters that she calls, I think, not girls or non-girls or non-boys or something like mm-hmm. that. They can span nationalities. Mm-hmm. Do you know the average amount of alters that somebody who has multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder would have?
I don't, but there's something inside me that says like 6.
So on average, they say anywhere from 2 to 100, but the average is around 10.
Okay. 2 to 100. And what, Jeni had 1,000?
Just wait. So I'm going to get just a little into the controversial psychological phenomenon that is dissociative identity disorder.
It is a controversy.
Mm-hmm. Because I had questions of my own about it. So I think it's fair to assume that at least one listener may also have questions, and hopefully I answer them. If not, please reach out. I'm going to give a disclaimer that while I will be calling it dissociative identity disorder for the most part, it is commonly known as multiple personality disorder. Mm-hmm. And that is actually the preferred terminology for Jeni and her alters, because dissociative identity disorder feels more clinical and multiple personality disorder encompasses the fact that each alter has their own personality, likes, dislikes, habits, hobbies, and talents. Mm-hmm. I'm going to primarily refer to it as dissociative identity disorder, not to be disrespectful, but as a person who has a degree in psychology, the clinical terminology feels more appropriate for me to use. So according to the DSM-5-TR, which is essentially the manual used for diagnosable mental health disorders that are recognized for mental health professionals, childhood trauma that starts before 5 usually increases the likelihood that that child will develop dissociative identity disorder. The trauma can be from rape, physical abuse, neglect, or severe bullying, which 90% of people who have been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder report having at least one of those experiences by their 6th birthday.
Yeah.
Clearly, Jeni fits this criteria, with her father beginning to abuse her basically at birth. But when she was 4 and they moved to Australia, it became particularly horrendous. Mm-hmm. As a means of coping, her brain began to create alters who would each serve their own role. Often the alters will emerge during traumatic moments to experience them rather than allowing their host to take the brunt of it.
Yeah.
Jeni's abuse was so consistent, so brutally violent, and so long enduring that sometimes her alters had to be retired. This process was carried out by the alter called the assassin, who was angry to find out after years of performing these assassinations that the retired alters had all been basically living their best lives at a carnival of sorts. So he felt like he was having to take on this responsibility of ending them, and then just found out that they'd all been in some sort of playhouse just enjoying themselves. The assassin, a 10-year-old male alter that would tap the alters that were being retired on the shoulder and escort them away, only did so after a meeting with several of the more prominent alters, if you will, plus a few alters relevant to that particular potential retiree. In the year 1977 alone, over 1,000 alters were escorted to retirement.
Say that again?
In the year 1977 alone, over 1,000 alters were escorted to their retirement.
Wow.
All in all, Jeni Haynes' mind created over 2,500 alters to help protect Jenny, Sheila, and their mother. Frank didn't seem to need the same level of protection, although they afforded him that as well. But apparently he was both charming and anatomically unappealing to their father.
You know, as we're talking about this, there are very few respectful depictions of DID or multiple personality disorder in mainstream media. Mm-hmm. There are a few that I think do a good job, like The United States of Terra with Toni Collette. Mm-hmm. That was a really fantastic series, and I think tried to honor DID. Also, and this is not the term I use, but Crazy Jane from Doom Patrol, which it's a DC comic adapted to television for HBO Max. And when you're sharing what you're sharing with me, it takes me kind of like to that place of, within the context of that show, Jane's alters all have different superpowers and they serve different purposes, right? Obviously, like what you've just discussed. Mm-hmm. And they all live in a place called the underground. And the way it's depicted is that Jane, who isn't the primary, it's actually a young girl named Kate who had to develop all of these personas. It shows them interacting, which is kind of contrary to, I think, how DID is clinically described.
Yeah.
But it does show that there are peaceful places in the underground, like a meadow, where these alters can go and relax, versus these kind of like, not necessarily battle stations, but almost like an underground subway that is not, it's harsh, it's brutalist architecture, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to hear you describe that there was this assassin persona that did this retiring of the different alters and what that looked like at a carnival. And so...
But he didn't know that.
Right. Which is, right. And that's kind of what like I'm kind of curious about right now, is that in the case of Jeni, were her alters aware of each other? Did they know of each other's existence? Did they work together?
Well, I told you they had to sit down and meet to determine if somebody needed to be retired. Like there was like a boardroom meeting of the prominent alters, which we'll get into some of them by name, but I didn't get into all of them. I did not necessarily name all of them because it would be a lot to try to follow.
You must have said that when my brain started thinking about Doom Patrol and their depiction of DID, because it, you know, even in the context of that show, she has 64 alters, and that's like a lot. That's more than a person can manage. Yeah. And so I can't imagine having thousands of I can't imagine any of it. Let's be frank. Right. I can't. It's just me, myself, and I. And thank God I didn't experience any kind of trauma that led me to DID. But it's...
I will say I watched a video today with the psychiatrist that Jeni went to and co-wrote the book with.
Okay.
And he said that it usually is something that happens before the age of 8, and that it is a response when the abused knows that they don't have a way to escape otherwise. Like physically, they can't escape from what is happening to them.
Does the abuse have to be chronic?
I don't know enough to say that. Okay. That is what I think, that it has to be.
I'm sure that's a risk factor.
Instance. Right.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I want you to continue. I had to get that out of my brain because that's what I keep envisioning. And I think it might contextualize an entertaining avenue for listeners to go and learn more about DID or at least see depictions of it.
I do think because of how controversial this particular diagnosis can be, that if you have questions, please ask them. And if I can answer them, I will, because I think if you have a question, somebody listening also probably has a question.
All my time in graduate school, we never talked about DID.
Right.
Like that was never even, not that it was treated as if it wasn't real, but it wasn't something that we ever discussed. You know, it wasn't like borderline personality disorder. It wasn't like bipolar disorder. It wasn't like MDD or ODD or anxiety or PTSD, right?
It's a lot more rare than a lot of the things that you were focused on. For some reason in undergrad, I did write a paper over dissociative identity disorder, but I couldn't for the life of me.
Was that a choice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. That's
But
why.
I couldn't for the life of me tell you what course it was for or why. But yeah. And when you were talking about the way that it is portrayed in movies and shows that you've seen, for me, the moment that I remember is in Law and Order SVU. Cynthia Nixon plays a character who has dissociative identity disorder, but actually she was faking it. But she spent a lot of time, she spent a lot of time researching dissociative identity disorder so that she and her sister could get away with murdering their parents to get their money. Anyway.
Okay.
Again, not a positive representation of it, because this whole time this character is pretending to have it and you don't realize that until the end. I'll get back into this. There are other acts that the person, who I can't believe I have to say is her father, has to do ritualistically. And if the ritual is disrupted in any way, he has to start over, almost like a compulsion.
Like what?
Like a progression of items being inserted into her rectum that gradually get larger until she's in so much pain that he then anally rapes her. And if after all of that trauma and suffering, her body responds by expelling the contents of her bowels, she's disgusting and accused of being filthy because he was just playing a, quote, nice game with her, and then she defecated all over the towels that he had laid down before beginning the assault. This particular assault created the alter Judas, who became determined to explain to their mother what was taking place. He tried a few times to tell, because that was kind of the purpose of his altar. But one of the times was when Jeni's sister, who had joined a church of sorts, that really just sounded to me like a cult. I don't know. I don't want to be inflammatory right now. So let's just say she joined this religious group and would invite Jeni to attend with her, which she did as a way to spend more time with Sheila. But then she said that once they would be picked up by the van that would take the kids to the church, that her sister would immediately ignore her and talk only to her friends instead. On what I believe was Jeni's first trip to the church, one of the women at the church, called Auntie, asked Jeni why she never smiled or laughed like the other children. Judas came forward and told her all of the terrible things that Jeni was forced to experience at the hands of her father. This older woman then took Jeni to a room with one of the deacons of the church, Brother Simon. He may have just been a church leader, and essentially told her that this child has already been broken in. And so then Jeni had to endure some of the same abuse from Brother Simon. In 1980, Jeni's dissociative identity disorder glitched.
How old is Jeni in 1980?
10.
10, okay.
Because the altar of a young girl was present, spending time with the grave of their cat, Tawny, and with Symphony, who is kind of like the lead altar.
Okay.
Symphony was originally created and then created the other altars with the different purposes to protect Jeni.
Okay.
And I'm going to get into this later, but there are actually two Jenis, because the Jeni altar that we see a lot from, and they're spelled different. One is Jeni and the other is Jenny. But one of them is the little girl who Symphony was created to protect. And there's another Jeni altar that is not even necessarily the same as the little girl, the original little girl, but she has met the little girl. So
That is very similar to Crazy Jane's role in
yeah.
Doom Patrol as an alter.
Yeah. So this little girl alter was present and was with Symphony. And the young female alter and Symphony did not realize that their father had approached and begun an attack. And this little girl would not typically have been the one to experience the abuse. She would not have been sent forward for that. And so the alters weren't prepared and had not been able to organize themselves. And the young girl couldn't handle the abuse. And so Symphony, who typically occupied the mind to help sort out which alters would be present during different moments, was forced to take over the body to relieve the young girl from the abuse. And Symphony got stuck inhabiting the body for about a year. It was as if she could speak with the other alters, but only through a veil or a door. Throughout that time, she was the sole forward alter and had to endure everything. Her fears and her habits were all sort of on display, and she felt alone because she wasn't able to really, in a meaningful way, interact with the other alters how she ordinarily would have to keep her from feeling so lonely. The other alters were able to come forward when they're needed, but they could just come to the door. They could never occupy the body or mind and take on the role that they were created to cope with. Since Symphony was the primary alter for an extended period of time, she remembered that she would go to bed around 8, sleep for approximately an hour before her mom went to bed, at which point her dad would come get her, take her to the garage, rape and sodomize her until about 3 a.m. Then she'd go back to bed, but he would show up there shortly after and continue to attack her until 6 a.m., when he'd then go to his bed to put on the ruse of not having been acting as a sick fuck from the time his wife went to bed.
Yeah.
And then, just when you can't imagine it getting worse, Symphony starts to have strange cravings. Her breast buds begin to ache. Her stomach begins to hurt and grow. Her mom doesn't know why she's so sick. Vomiting. She can't keep food down. One night, when her dad comes in to climb on top of her, he sees her belly moving. He lays on top of her stomach and applies as much pressure as he can. It's not effective. Her stomach is still moving the following day. In the days following, he forces her to drink something that she describes as having visible fumes rising, which she initially refused, but he forced her to drink it, and it was also not effective. So then he brought in a knitting needle and jabbed it inside of her repeatedly before then raping her and forcing himself into her so violently that she felt she would be ripped into two. In the days after, he lashes her stomach with a belt, buckle forward, and then stomps on her stomach. This attempt to prevent further swelling and movement in her stomach is so severe that she fainted from the pain. Days later, her stomach rumbled and she began to bleed severely. And when she noticed that the grass she had been sitting on was covered in dark blood, she called to her father. He blamed her for bringing this on herself, and she had a fleeting thought that her punishments he had been administering had caused the stomach growth and pain and now blood. He finally came over to her and she showed him the blood and hoped that he would help her. Instead, he assaulted her, called her filthy, and walked away. Jeni did not realize until 2010, while speaking with a detective that had put all the pieces together, that she had given birth in 1980 at 10 years old, 8 months pregnant. Before the age of 11, Jeni had been pregnant 5 times.
Oh my God.
Between 11 and 14, her father had impregnated her 7 additional times. She had a similar experience at 8, but much earlier on in the pregnancy. Again, I've left out quite a few details.
Yeah.
She had 4 miscarriages, and in 1982, her father beat another baby out of her. After realizing that she had given birth and not been able to bring herself to look into the toilet, and this we're talking, 40 years after the fact? Jeni felt immense guilt, and she shared that with her alter Jay. Jay assured Jeni that her daughter, Gemma, was with him and was fine. He was caring for her. In 2022, in addition to Gemma, Jeni named her other babies, Eric, Rosemary, Cherry Lynn, Bobby, Carrie Ann, and Jessie. One of the only pieces of solace she was able to find in the loss of her babies and, in essence, her motherhood was that her daughters never grew to know the abuse of their father the way she had. So back to 1980, Symphony is still trapped, unable to access the other altars. They're all distraught because only Symphony holds the key that will unlock them and the DID that allows them to do all of their jobs. And after her father attacks her in the toilet, orally raping her until he is finished with his assault. And then she says the magic words that allow the altars to open the door and get their system of protection back in place. She asks, "Can I go now?" And she can. Symphony can finally be relieved of this constant torture in almost every imaginable or unimaginable way. Are you following what I'm saying? Because I feel like some of the details that I've left out may be interfering with continuity or understanding.
I feel like I am following.
Okay.
Is there a specific thing you think I might be missing?
So when they moved to Australia, there was a house that they ended up renting that nobody but Richard wanted to rent. And part of the reason that he wanted to rent it, I think, or buy it, I don't know, is that the bathroom was detached and the garage was detached. And so those ended up being the places that he would attack Jeni. So just that, really. So it ended up creating a lot of trauma around bathrooms for her. So, unfortunately, the key that opened the passage between the altars and Symphony only alleviated her pain by allowing another altar called Muscles to replace her. And when she had asked if she could leave, Richard responded by forcing himself into their mouth again. But because Muscles had taken over after a year of not being able to protect Symphony, he decided to fight back and bit down hard. This led to a beating so severe that he passed out, but when he came to, the sound of Richard's squawking in pain brought Jeni and the altars some peace after having to witness the abuse that Richard had subjected Symphony to for all that time.
Yeah.
After Jeni's pregnancy that made it to 8 months, her father seemingly grew concerned that his atrocious actions would be found out. So he pushed for a move from Australia back to England in 1981. The move to England was exciting for Jeni because she, much like myself, did not fully have a grasp on the differences between the English education system and the education system she knew in Australia. And the US education system, which is a story for another day. But for me, that's my experience. Quite different. Jeni believed that the boarding schools she had read about in English books were the standard, and she was optimistic that she would finally be able to escape her father's abuse. But that was not the case. She was enrolled in the local junior school and was at home with her mother and her abuser every night.
Where's Judas? Does he try reporting it again now?
He does come forward and talk other times, but a lot of the times it's not taken seriously or it's met with further abuse. So then it's conditioning him in a certain way. So that is his mission, though. That is his goal, is to tell. Richard alternated between vaginal rape and sodomy, and he would take a lot of gratification from Jeni or whichever altar was serving as host, protesting, struggling, or crying, which is just so sadistic. At first, they were in a rental property in England before finding a home of their own. And once they found that home, he fell into a routine of disallowing anyone but Jeni to be in the living room after dinner, where he would assault her with a belt until she began to cry, at which point he would take his cue to rape her.
And the mom didn't know?
The mom didn't. We are going to get into it. The mom didn't know. I know that you and a lot of the listeners are feeling some type of way. We're going to get into it. I'm going to explain it to you in a way that I do think that you're going to understand. But the mom didn't know. She and Jeni she's been Jeni's number one advocate since she did find out, but she did not know.
How could you not know?
I know.
How could you not know?
I know, but he was abusing everyone in the house.
Okay, sure. I'm sure you're going to break it down for me later, but
I understand the urge to be upset with
I don't
her
mean
mother.
to cast aspersions. It's just altogether hard to believe
Sure.
that there was no awareness.
I think it's going to make sense because I got to a point in the book where I was like, okay, this does make sense. I think it will make sense to you.
Okay. Let's get to it.
So,
my God, I mean this in a complimentary way. I've never wanted a case to be over more. I've never wanted to be done. It is making me feel sick. I'm so over it. It's so disgusting.
I know. I have left out the graphic bits.
Yeah, which is crazy because it still feels so graphic.
I know.
It's
unimaginable.
It is traumatic. It evades description. It is so awful that it cannot even be verbalized how it's making me feel. And so I can't even begin to grasp what Jeni and her alters are going through, because I know that those alters are feeling the same experiences. They might be able to handle it differently. They serve purposes, but ultimately,
retired.
Yeah, anyone being violated, any personality being violated is still painful. It still produces significant harm.
That's why 1,000 of them had to leave within the span of that 1 year.
I love that the assassin retires them versus it's such a.
I loved that the 10-year-old assassin thought that they were dying and then gets mad when he finds out that they've just been at a carnival this whole time.
Why couldn't I be at the fucking carnival?
Why do I have to tap people and escort them over to have fun? Yeah.
Man, the comedy is nowhere to be found in today's episode.
Just a true crime podcast now.
Yeah, today is just true. That is just true crime. And I'm having
inappropriate reactions, but
because it's awful.
Right.
It's awful.
It was, traumatizing to me to read the book, to read the parts that she and her alters wrote in graphic detail, the things that I don't even want to call him a man, that this creature did. And then also to have so much upheaval and turmoil and emotional height in my own personal life.
Mm-hmm. God, how far we came right now? How much is left?
We're on page 10 out of 20.
Okay,
so
halfway.
I wanted to sing Bon Jovi to you. Yeah.
Okay, I can do halfway. If you had told me longer than that, I would have been done. It is getting to me. I'm fine, but it's bad. And you told me it was bad, but it's hard to imagine how bad something can be until you're in it and you're listening. So listeners, this is hard for us too. This is it's sick.
It is. Yeah.
We are not
quite depraved.
Do we experience psychopathy? God, who knows, but not to the extent where this doesn't matter, where it is unfazing.
I think we get a little desensitized to some things. This is not something that we have been desensitized to, and I really hope that it's not something that we ever are desensitized to. This is awful.
It can't be commonplace. It can't be commonplace. It can't be commonplace.
So, living room, after dinner, no one else was allowed in there. She was 11 when this new routine began, and after he was done abusing her, he would make her dry all of the dishes alone in the kitchen. No one was allowed to help her with this task either. When one of Jeni's alters, Linda, made the connection between... Oh no.
Sorry, the fact that this child created an alter named Linda it's not like a funny name, but the idea that they have an alter named Muscles and an alter named Symphony, assassin. And then there's Linda.
The assassin. Yeah. There's also Jay, who's American. I think it's Jay who's American.
But then there's Judas.
There's Judas, yeah.
It's what the fuck purpose does Linda serve? Is she just like a drop of normalcy?
There's another alter that's created when she begins to go to school and do well in school. That is just called the Student.
Okay.
There's Little Ricky. There are a lot of alters. How creative do you have to get to have 2,500?
Yeah.
Okay, so Linda, yeah. Linda made the connection between Richard's apparent excitement when she would exhibit signs of distress or pain. And so she refused to feed his perversion, suppressing her pain and fear.
Okay, Linda's a badass alter.
Yeah. This was not appreciated by her father, and so he became more brutal, more violent, and more sadistic with her. The assaults became so routine because for a span of 2 years, not including the established weekend abuse, so he would abuse her every weekend, but not necessarily every weekday, until this point, where for the span of 2 years, Jeni was raped by her father every single school night. She recalled in her book that she began to expect an attack at any moment, so much so that it got to the point that when she was attacked, she could relax from holding the tension, anticipating the next attack.
Oh, God. Yeah.
At the age of 11, there were only 3 weeks in what Jeni and her alters are able to recall throughout their life that they were not raped by their father. I'm not sure if they or her is the appropriate language to use. I don't know if I should keep it singular for Jeni herself or use the plural form to include the alters that were created to protect her. I don't know if I'm doing this right or not. The book is written by several of the alters working together to compile the horrific narrative that they all endured. So I wasn't able to garner the proper way to address anyone being abused from that. But that's probably why I'm inclined to use the plural pronouns. And as I did read the rest of the book, it's not really consistent. So sometimes she's using first person singular and sometimes it is first person plural. So I think that it's fine. It just depends on what you're talking about. Obviously, if you're talking in general about what is going on, plural, because various alters are experiencing various different things.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's a thing that I am now familiar with. School uniforms. Commonly, British students have a uniform that is expected of them while at school, and a blazer is a pretty standard piece of that uniform. There are formal and informal uniform checks, and there are uniform passes, and so on and so forth. And Jeni's parents refused to buy her the blazer for her school uniform, which left her cold during lessons, in trouble for not being in proper uniform, and markedly different from her peers, which is a nightmare in 2025. So I can only imagine what 1981 would have been like for a child who is different. In 1982, so Jeni would be 12 at this point. Her birthday's in January, I believe. So pretty much, she was born in 1970. So pretty much, if we're talking about the year, you just go from 70 up. Yeah.
Yeah.
The family took a trip to the Isle of Wight, and they went to a museum that showcased the history of the island. Jeni's father took her into a wax room that showcased horrible crimes, and that was where she saw a wax display of a woman being raped by a man. And at that point, she learned the name and other implications of what her father had been doing to her entire life. She was confused because this was also how she learned that what the wax display was exhibiting was considered a horrible crime. But her father had always told her it was a punishment for her being naughty and filthy.
Thank God for museums.
She asked him as they were leaving the museum about this, why it said it was a horrible crime when he always called it a punishment, and he punched her in the face, splitting her lip open. So without getting too into the dynamics of the family, for the sake of time, Richard realized that Sheila was growing up and began to ingratiate himself with her. It's not necessarily clear if he ever abused her sexually to this point or to the extent that he abused Jeni, but she lapped up this newfound attention from the person in the home who was the most abusive and neglectful of emotional needs. Sheila and Richard developed a special bond, and he began to use this to cause a divide between Sheila and Jeni. I have to assume that by now you've wondered, if not already asked me, about Jeni's mom and how this abuse could go unnoticed for so long. It's important to remember that Richard was a controlling nightmare of an abusive asshole who threatened regularly to kill Pat. So that alone would possibly have been a very effective method of keeping her at bay, or at least obeying when he says you're not allowed to come in here. But add on to it the fact that she was on antidepressants, and this was the early 1980s. So far fewer advancements had been made for antidepressants at that point. And in the middle of 1983, her doctor changed her medication, and the fog she had been living in since she began taking it cleared. She kind of returned to her body, returned to the family, and was more present. And shortly after this, she attempted to show Richard physical affection, and he rebuffed her touch, told her that he did not love her and hadn't in a while, but that she was welcome to stay married to him provided she cleaned the home. I mean, sounds like a dream, right?
Mm-hmm.
He continued doting on Sheila, and the whole thing was just really bizarre, but he loved seeing his wife and his younger daughter in pain. He really relished it. So by heralding Sheila, it caused pain for Pat and Jeni. And so he continued to do it more because that was his whole thing. Mm-hmm. He got off on creating pain and painful situations. Once Pat was no longer zoned out all the time, she did begin to realize some of the abuse that was taking place, particularly at mealtimes, when Sheila knew that if she stated that she liked a particular part of the meal, that Richard would take that from Jeni's plate and give her portion to Sheila. And she noticed that Sheila complimented each part of the meal until Jeni was left one time with a single solitary baked bean in a soup of bean juice on her place after her fish and chips and the rest of her beans were all scraped onto Sheila's plate. So, do you want to talk at all about the fact that she was on these antidepressants that turned her into a zombie? So much so that she wasn't even aware of the fact that Jeni was being starved.
You know, I don't want to be disingenuous and pretend like I know everything about Gen 1, Gen 2 antidepressants. I mean, I remember like in psychopharmacology, or maybe it was like neurobiology, we talked about those different generations of antidepressants and the kind of breakthroughs they led to. But a lot of time, I know that those generations of drugs aren't used anymore, and that's for a reason. And I think sometimes they are still incorporated if someone has like a treatment resistant depression. But like MAOIs, those are like what I typically think of when I think of older generation antidepressants. And like, I think they're called tricyclic antidepressants, and they can create brain fog. Like MAOIs prevent the brain from like either breaking down or producing neurotransmitters. And so I could see how that would lead someone to developing a really thick fog, especially considering if they were taking other medications with it, their other life circumstances. Yes, it is still hard for me to reconcile that she didn't notice until then, because what kind of dosage was she on? What generation antidepressant was she using? What was it? And what are its typical effects?
Yeah.
I think that now that you've shared that, there's a chance to redeem my impression, right? Is she going to do anything now that she sees this abuse? Is she going to do something to help Jeni, or is she going to continue to sit idly by? And I think that's going to really make or break my opinion.
I do want to just cut in and say something that I didn't include, but she also has a few snippets that she includes in the book that she writes directly to Jeni, because they've obviously talked about everything that Jeni endured and the fact that she felt like she was alone and that nobody cared and so on and so forth. And I think you can find interviews of the two of them together where the mom is like, I did not know what was going on, because if I did, I would not have sat back and allowed it to continue. So I think we'll also have to think about the environment that he created, the choices that he made in like where they lived, and he would move furniture to make it so that it would be harder to see what was going on. He was also very calculating in what he was doing. So we can't ignore that entirely, but it is very hard to believe that it went on for this long and was unnoticed. But then Jeni also talks about in the book how teachers and parents are supposed to look for drastic changes in behavior, but he was abusing her from birth. There was no change. It was just who she was. Early on in her life, her mom took her to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, she's just attention seeking. So there were times where the medical system, healthcare workers failed to see that there was anything bigger going on.
Yeah, I think that's what it comes down to. That she was failed at every turn. Who is protecting her? And so it's obviously the blame lies with the father, right? With Richard. He is scum. There's not a word for what he is.
Absolutely not.
The level of depravity is unspeakable, unconscionable. But the fact that so many people failed her, the idea that this, when you talked about how she was traumatized once again by the cult, and what was his name? Brother Simon?
Yeah.
Father Simon?
Brother.
I can't imagine. Sorry, there was a bug on me. I can't imagine what religious sect
I saw
that
you
was.
do it, and I was like, the only explanation for this movement is that there was a bug on him.
It was crawling on me.
There was a bug on me.
She was just failed and failed and failed and failed. And I think that's what upsets me the most. And I would hope that a mother, regardless of circumstance, would be able to make notice or see, or maybe, I don't know. I'm hoping that the mother gets to have some kind of redemption in this story, because right now it feels so bleak. And as you're telling me this story, my job as a therapist is to inspire hope and change and help people find joy in their life and meaning in their life. And the story you've told me so far, I don't know how Jeni or her alters come back from this. I don't know how they make a life. I don't know how they do anything other than contemplate suicidality, because it feels so hopeless.
And I'll say that I watched a video right before we started the recording where I believe it was her psychiatrist said that you imagine exactly what you said, that there is no hope. And he said that he doesn't know how, but Jeni still has a lot of hope. She's still very hopeful. She's still very positive.
It's
like today,
mind-boggling.
Jeni, I know. I think that if she didn't have hope, she wouldn't have survived her childhood.
If she wouldn't have made altars, she wouldn't have survived her childhood.
Close, but there were times where she physically was so close to not surviving her childhood. Yeah. I mean, again, not to be too graphic, but she was bleeding constantly from everything.
Yeah.
So she was left with one baked bean because...
Oh my God.
Because Sheila thought that the fish and chips and beans were just so delicious. So this incident and a later incident where the family went to McDonald's and Frank asked for a ruler because McDonald's was selling a stationery set and he just wanted the ruler from the set. But Richard refused to allow Frank to have a ruler and instead bought the entire stationery set in full
for Sheila.
By the way, just an aside, he had chosen a table for 4, which meant that Jeni had to sit alone.
And Mom still didn't know?
So Sheila also refused to allow Frank to have the ruler. And that was the final straw for Pat. She decided then and there that she would be divorcing Richard.
That was the final straw. Sheila decided Frank couldn't have the ruler. Over. Game over. Done.
It wasn't that Sheila decided that. It was that Richard wouldn't buy Frank the ruler, but instead bought Sheila the whole set. So it wasn't a matter of, I can't. But those 2 incidents of her seeing the way that Jeni was being starved and Frank was being neglected in another way and abused in a way, because to buy it for one after the other one has expressed wanting it. Anyway, yes, she decided that she would be divorcing Richard. It's very likely that he was grooming and possibly sexually abusing Sheila. But again, I don't want to say with certainty that it was happening. So all of this attention came about.
Sheila is a victim herself.
Right. So all this attention that Richard had for Sheila came about after he noticed that she was growing up and becoming a woman, but he also wanted her approval and appreciation. And I think that she substituted the positive attention she was getting at the church with the positive attention she was now getting from her father. She stopped going to the church because she was really just looking for somebody to show her attention. And if we're being honest, she was being groomed at the church as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is so funny because I say, remember when the doctor diagnosed Jeni as attention seeking? But I didn't include that. I just told you that as an aside, but okay. Sure, Cameron. It turns out that her, quote, tantrums were epileptic seizures.
Oh, no.
And it wasn't until Christmas 1983 that she learned of this condition.
Wait, were they epileptic seizures or were they psychogenic non-epileptic seizures?
The official diagnosis that Jeni spoke about in the book was epileptic seizures. If her doctor gets into any difference in the diagnoses, I don't know. I didn't read his parts.
Okay.
So it is around this time that Jeni finally begins to feel emboldened enough to stand up to Richard. He repeatedly calls her Maggot, which is a nickname born of a bonding moment that he had with Sheila, where they found a carcass covered in maggots, and Richard said it reminded him of Jeni.
Jesus.
And one day, Jeni got so sick of it that she took the knife she had been using to peel potatoes and pressed it against his throat. Apparently morality won out and she didn't actually kill him, but she wanted to. Or whoever was host at that time.
She should have said, Muscles, come on up. It's your time to shine.
Honestly, assassin. Here's your moment. Another time, he was beating her with his belt, and she grabbed the end of it and blamed him for the conditions that led to her needing to be punished. And she ended up just walking out of the room at that point and defying his order to return. So between her mother coming out of the antidepressant fog state and deciding to stand up to him herself, Jeni had someone who would defend her when she witnessed the injustices of his behavior toward her. And on February 12th, 1984, after accepting a new job, Richard and Sheila moved to Wales, leaving Pat, Frank, and Jeni in England. As you can probably imagine, finally Jeni and her alters were free. Not that they fully believed that their nightmare was over, but they were relieved enough that the first night he was gone, Jeni was able to sleep through the night without wetting the bed, something that she'd never experienced before, after living her entire life in constant fear of her father showing up to abuse her. The part where you were talking about the differences in the way that the design of the mind is relevant here, because mentally her alters were able to redesign their world in Jeni's mind, making it a much more comfortable place for them to enjoy. So it had been kind of like a chamber that was created that reflected the way that she was treated by Richard. But now they can make it cozier. But that was just in her mind, because physically Jeni's body was damaged beyond what she could have realized. So again, this part is going to get into a little bit of medical trauma and damage to Jeni's body. So if that's difficult for you, here's your warning. You might want to skip ahead or come back next week when Hayden tells us a case about a fun clown that got a speeding ticket or something to really lighten this shit up.
I look for something darker.
Oh no. Oh no. Please don't. So Jeni's bowels were so damaged that she was nearly in a constant state of constipation. And when she would be able to empty her bowels, it was always accompanied with blood and pain. He'd damaged her coccyx to the point that her tailbone had to be removed, but all of this didn't happen until later in life. He had broken several of her ribs, damaged nerves, calcified jaw ligaments, and she was left with a clicking jaw. Jeni, who I'll point out at this point, now that we've moved into the surviving section of the book she wrote, speaks almost exclusively in first person plural, referring to herself as well as her alters. So as I was saying, she was examined by a doctor in 2011, and as a result of what the doctor saw in her anus and rectum, was taken in for emergency surgery.
Yeah.
From the damage that was done in the 70s and 80s in 2011. Naturally, there was severe psychological damage that she and her alters had to deal with as well. They were all terrified of bathrooms, had an aversion to people putting things in their mouth, so the dentist was not an option, and their dental health was not great. But it wasn't all terrible, because now that Jeni was free from the imminent fear of her father, she was able to engage more meaningfully in her education. She joined all the sports her new school offered, and she went from being one of the lowest performing students in English class to the highest. She said that she was still trying to process what her father did to her, because she still didn't necessarily know what it was. She had some inklings, but that she went from being able to devote 10% of her attention to her classes to 40%. She also really loved music and had used it as a way to help herself cope, and I couldn't miss the opportunity to take this dark-ass case and include a reference to Drag Race, because she specifically cited Wham, and we know that Tace's father was a member of Wham. She said that what she learned from the song Relax by the band Frankie Goes to Hollywood was that she did not have to do things just because she was told to. Although it was much later that she realized that the song was actually about slowing down during intercourse to, I guess, smell the flowers, so to speak. Appreciate the journey, if you will. In November 1988, Pat, Jeni, and Frank moved back to Australia after realizing that none of their family in the UK on either side particularly wanted them there. So I guess there's also that to think about, the environment that Pat was raised in. Yeah. Apparently, Pat's mom was, one of the alters did tell her she was a miserable old bitch or something. And Jeni had to apologize for it, and she was like, I didn't even do it. Like, she was confused because she would lose time. Right, that's one of the signs that somebody has DID.
Something dissociative for sure. If you're losing time, there's dissociation to some level.
Yeah. So Pat invited Sheila to move with them from Wales, but Sheila hated Australia and them, so she declined. Again, she's a victim. Those are probably not her words.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just before leaving, the family of 5 met up together in London to say farewell. And Jeni didn't see her father again until the late 1990s. In 1993, I do get to a point where I kind of jump around a bit, especially once we've gotten to this surviving piece.
Yeah, things are feeling a lot lighter. You jump wherever you want to.
So in 1993, after 6 weeks of being on Prozac, all of a sudden, Jeni woke up to the 2,500 alters hanging out in her head. She could hear them all having conversations, asking questions or for advice, answering one another, various accents, children crying, everything. And she was not only painfully cognizant of it, but was unable to turn it off. It was constant and cacophonous. And it was through this newfound discovery of her dissociative identity disorder that Jeni discovered that she was also an alter created by Symphony, like I mentioned before. And she was able to meet the original Jennifer that they had all been working so hard to protect. So she began to introduce herself to people as the entity currently known as Jeni, for others to understand her role as an alter as well. In 1996, Sheila called Pat and said that Richard was beginning to get violent and that she needed to get away from him. So Sheila is older than Jeni, and Jeni would be 26 at this point, but it seems like she was still living with Richard and experiencing the cycle of violence there. She admitted to Jeni that Richard had raped her, and Jeni disclosed the same to Sheila. It seems that there was a time several years prior that Jeni called trying to make amends with her father, wanting to leave the past in the past, and her sister wanted to speak with her on the phone during that call. And while on the call, Sheila seemingly badgered Jeni, asking her what it was that caused caused the rift initially between her and their father. So probably trying to seek confirmation that she was experiencing something that Jeni had also experienced.
Yeah.
She was very insistent and demanding the information of Jeni.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall, part of the pact that Jeni made with her father was with regard to the fact that he would not do any harm to Sheila. Remember, she permitted him to do whatever he wanted to her, provided he left Sheila alone.
Right.
And so learning of this abuse that he was inflicting on Sheila, he had broken the pact. And immediately, Pat and Jeni sprung into action. At this point, Judas had told Pat about what had happened, which was permitted now that the pact was broken by her father.
Mm-hmm.
They called Pat's mother and they told her what had happened, and asked if Sheila could stay with her until they were able to secure her move to Australia. And surprisingly, she agreed immediately. She believed Jeni, with whom to this point she'd had a complicated relationship with, without any hesitation. So that's big. In 1997, Jeni learned that her father would be facing 11 counts of abuse for his treatment of Sheila and 4 for his treatment of Jeni. She hadn't been disclosing any information for justice for herself. She was just telling enough information to people to help Sheila escape from his grasp.
Mm-hmm.
But then she realized that with criminal charges being sought for what he had done to her, that she needed to tell the whole story, not just abbreviated sections of it. The day that Jeni and her mom were flown back to the UK after their subpoenas to be in court was the same day as Princess Diana's funeral, which we've talked about before on this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So their flight was full of people mourning the loss of the people's princess. And I'm just going to cut through some of the BS and tell you that Richard pleaded guilty in exchange for a deal for 9 of the charges pertaining to Sheila, but he pleaded not guilty to the 4 charges related to Jeni. And because he pleaded not guilty, the judge found him not guilty. Simple as that. As a result of that failure for justice for Jeni, yet again, many of her alters took their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Some of Jeni's core alters, the ones who are often found at the wheel, if you will, began drafting ideas about ways to end all of their suffering as well. The lack of justice for Jeni, the fact that Sheila was seemingly believed and Jeni wasn't, was just further confirmation that what Richard had told her all those years was true. No one would believe Jeni because no one cared about her.
Yeah. God, that's tough.
A professional recommended that she be taken to the hospital, and she was put on suicide watch, but she wasn't taken immediately because her mom was like, no, you're not suicidal, you're fine. Which, the 90s. She was in the hospital on suicide watch for 3 weeks, and Frank visited her during that time and told her that he believed her about everything. So this part is going to just fast track the healing part of Jeni's journey.
Yeah.
She involved herself in an academic environment and helped write this book with Dr. George Blair-West, whose sections I did not read, although they probably would be my primary focus of reading if I were reading for entertainment rather than for storytelling purposes.
Yeah.
They are interspersed throughout the sections about Jeni's experiences and explain some of the psychological processes that Jeni was dealing with, and then the treatment that was done. And I do think that you would enjoy those sections of the book.
For sure.
Yeah. Maybe skip some of the more brutal pieces.
Yeah.
I've given you the highlights, but you'll struggle to read them. I struggled to trust people near me while I was reading about her experiences. So anyway, she went through the process of integration with her alters, which she says really quieted down her head and felt a bit lonely. There were not 2,500 voices in her head anymore. After 6 years of therapy and 6 years of prison for Richard, Jeni called him after being urged to forgive and forget for her own mental well-being. He was in prison, and he was receptive to her contact for once. There were times where she would call, and he would say, I don't want to talk to you, or he wouldn't even take the call. Like, he was just abusive in every way possible to her.
I really wanted him to be murdered.
It would be nice.
Like, I that sounds terrible, but there's... Oh, my God. Sometimes there's just no justice. Nothing could ever be done. Nothing could ever be done to right the wrongs that Jeni and Sheila and Frank and Pat, that they all experienced and faced. But Richard deserved a lot worse than what he got.
Yeah. So he apologized generically for the way that he had affected Jeni, but never truly admitted to the abuse that was sexual in nature. Long story short, he got released early for good behavior, and Jeni suggested that he come visit the family in Australia for a short period. I just want to say, because I know that I was thinking it and you are maybe thinking it too, but it was very complicated that her abuser was also her father.
Absolutely.
There was nothing that would untie those two things. And so she still craved a relationship with her father. She does talk about positive moments that they shared. They had something that they shared in common, and they did have moments where it wasn't just him being entirely abusive. They had moments that they shared that were positive. I didn't really get into it because that's more for her than what it would do for us or our listeners, but it's complicated because you'll see that she has reached out to him to try to have a relationship with him, and that's not uncommon when we're talking about abuse victims. But he was happy to arrange the visit. He went to Australia, and instead of getting a hotel as they had discussed, he set up shop in the back room of the house that she and her mother lived in, right near the bathroom, which didn't lock. At some point, the home was raided because he had not disclosed his criminal activity on his visa application, and he was permitted to stay on the condition that he must stay at Jeni's home. On her 35th birthday in 2005, after nearly constant prodding that Jeni talk about her childhood so they could figure out what had happened to her, he always said, "We need to talk about what happened to you in Australia so we can figure it out." Because, you see, Richard never touched Jeni, and they had to get to the bottom of this. She finally had an angry reaction to his pushing of the subject and denial of the role, which, as you may figure out, was exactly what he wanted so that he would become sexually aroused. Remember, anytime there was pushback.
Yeah, that's sadistic streak.
Yeah, so she fled into the bathroom, and he cornered her there and simulated intercourse between her thighs. It was not penetrative, but it was traumatizing. And she had realized in the days immediately after they submitted his visa application that all of his good behavior in prison and his new doting, loving father routine was just an act. Fortunately, he ended up not passing the character test for the visa application, and on June 10th, 2005, he was deported back to England, where he would be registered as a sex offender and forced to, in part, be held responsible for the actions he had taken against his oldest daughter. Which was why he wanted to stay in Australia, because he had lied about his criminal past and he wouldn't have had to register as a sex offender. In 2007, Jeni was awarded the certificate she earned for her Doctor of Philosophy degree. 2 years later, she cut her father off for good and then spent her time in fear that her father might find a new partner with children and attack them, but also torn about speaking to someone about it because of all the times the system had failed her and she had not felt heard or been believed. So in 2009, she couldn't stand the idea that she may be complicit in allowing another child to be harmed in the ways that she had been by not saying anything. So she spoke with a detective and started off the conversation by letting him know that she had multiple personality disorder. He responded positively, telling her that her diagnosis actually made her statements about the abuse her father had enacted on her more credible. And so finally she was being heard. For 5 years, they had put together a task force after this, investigating the crimes of Richard Haynes committed in Australia. Another 2 years went by before they were able to file for him to be extradited from the United Kingdom on 367 charges.
Wow.
It seems that by 2019, when the trial was stood, he was facing 85 charges. And Jeni was the first person in history to testify using her different alters, or maybe with that known and approved, because we can't really know if.
Right.
In May 2019, she was able to deliver her nearly 11,000 word victim impact statement. And on September 6th, 2019, an Australian judge found Richard Haynes guilty and sentenced him to 45 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2050 at the ripe age of 104. So he won't get out. He will die there. And as a victim of sexual abuse, Jeni could have opted to remain anonymous, protecting her identity, but it would have protected her father's identity as well. And she wanted him to go to prison and have everyone know exactly what he was there for.
Yeah.
She wanted him to be made as uncomfortable in prison every day as he had made her childhood.
Yeah.
And so now Jeni is reclaiming her life, and she refuses to do things that don't make her happy. She is living for herself.
Good. She deserves that.
And that's my case.
Wow. That was sufficiently awful, despite having no death. That was, you did it, gal. Not once did I wish, man, where's the murder? This case raises a lot of really interesting questions about, well, for me, cycles of abuse. Were these behaviors learned? Was Richard himself a victim of such violence? Obviously, Jeni experienced horrible, unspeakable tragedy and trauma. And there's no making up for it. There's only living with it. There is no erasing it. There is no diminishing it. I think you told me earlier, and I don't know if it was on the recording or not, that EMDR was used as part of her treatment protocol. And EMDR is incredibly effective at desensitizing people to their tragedy, and helping them to process it in a way, or reprocess it in a way that allows them to live without that lingering and hanging over them. And so it's an incredible tool. It's hard to imagine that any amount of EMDR, any amount of psychotherapy, any amount of IFS parts work, any amount of medication could dull the pain of her experience. But from what you've shared, she continues to move forward, and she looks for ways to be joyous and hopeful in her life. And she finds ways to make meaning that truly liberate her from some of the pain that she endured. And I think that's an incredible story. It's harrowing, but it's also inspirational. And it leaves me with other questions about Sheila's experience and Frank's experience, because it's hard to imagine. I'm sure that Frank didn't get through unscathed, right? More than just neglect, it's hard to imagine that he didn't face direct abuse. It also makes me curious, what kind of abuse did Sheila endure? You know, despite the fact that she at some point was made, the golden fleece.
It was after she made an apple pie. She made an apple pie, and Pat was like, "Oh, this is incredible that you made this," because she was not feeling well, and I think Sheila had gone to pick up the ingredients, and then she had gotten the recipe from one of her classes at school, and she went ahead and made it. And Pat was so proud and excited, and she was like, "Look," and she was telling Richard, and Jeni said that there was something about the way that Richard responded to that, where it was like this dawning that he realized that Sheila was growing up. I don't know. Some of it, again, because our narrator is somebody who loses time, some of it was hard to follow, but I got the gist for sure.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised at how little was in that case that I wrote, even though I'm the one who wrote it, because there was so much that I left out. I think to say for Jeni, though, you're talking about how inspirational it is that she was able to kind of get past this and to still carry hope and all of those things. I don't want to downplay how important it had to be after so many times of feeling like she wasn't loved, cared about, heard, believed, that people began to believe her. People began to act. People began to... I mean, the timing of her mom switching antidepressants and being able to be more present, and Jeni feeling emboldened enough to start standing up to Richard, that's not connected.
Right.
And so when her grandmother, who she had a complicated relationship with, who didn't want them to be in the UK... when she believed her, when Frank said he believed her, the fact that Pat did believe Jeni when she did start talking to her, the fact that Sheila was talking about some of the same experiences that she'd had, which probably lent some credibility to what Jeni was saying. The detective, I think that those things were monumental in her being able to have hope, being able to persevere and overcome. But she has to have she's just so strong. But I think when it's all you've ever known, when from birth you're being abused by your father in ways that no one should ever be abused, but it's really awful to think that this would happen to a child. That was all she'd ever known. So she didn't really have a choice but to be strong, because to her it was the norm.
Yeah.
Which is so unbelievable.
To know that that's the only schema that existed, that's what informed her, the entirety of her personhood and her experiences, is, well, like you said, it does a great deal of the explanation for us, right? There's no investigating further, because that's just the truth of it. That's the long and the short, is that is what she knew. That is all she knew. That's all there was available to her. And so, I don't know, Cameron, this was a tough case.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I didn't express gratitude, but thank you.
Well, I'm saying you're welcome because you said it was a tough case, and I left the toughest things out.
Yeah. And you did a great job.
It was still a tough case.
Yeah. Really, really great storytelling on your part.
And it lives in here now.
At least one listener is going to wish it had stayed there.
Yeah, that's fair. When I set out to do this case, I had no intention of reading the book and getting into the graphic content. But then it became clear to me that it would be hard to do this case justice without being able to share or understand some of the graphic stuff. And then I was just invested, and flights were delayed, and I was on an overnight flight that I couldn't sleep on. So instead I was reading about the crimes of Richard Haynes.
Yeah.
Well, all of that to say, don't forget that 988 is there if you're feeling like you're having a mental health crisis, or if you are feeling suicidal, give them a call and somebody will be there for you. A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode, as if it wasn't a fuck ton. If you enjoyed listening,
is a wild thing to say right now.
If you enjoyed listening, if you enjoyed listening, and if you didn't, but want to hear more, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and I guess leave a review about how incredibly endearing this story is.
Recommend us to a friend, and if you're able and willing to help us produce this podcast, sign up for our Patreon.
Yes, the link to joining our supportive bestie tier for only $2 a month is listed in the show notes. Also, make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so feel free to reach out with questions or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.